The Bread and Butter Collective is a collection of hospitality professionals working together to help strengthen our industry to build strong culture, community, and sustainability.
I'm Calen McNeil.
And I'm Sam Jones. And this is the Bread and Butter Podcast.
All right, welcome to the Bread and Butter Podcast. Hi, Sam. How are you?
Calen, I'm doing great today. Thanks a lot. How are you doing? Did you have a nice week?
I did, yeah. I think the week has been good. It kind of feels like spring is in the air, even though we're still in February. But that will, I'm sure, I'll be punished for even thinking spring is in the air with -5, whatever they call it, atmospheric river, or some kind of cold dome or something will come up.
There's going to be a dome, and it's going to come up, and it's going to ruin all the tulips that are coming up in my garden right now.
Oh my goodness, I can't even imagine tulips.
They're all confused. The grass is confused. The tulips are confused. It's confusing. But maybe we've got someone on this week who's going to shed some real light on this. Maybe some warmth, perhaps even.
Well, let's hope. I mean, I think, if Eddy Carmack can't shed some light on some stuff, then I imagine we're going to have to go back to our President Maryanne and quiz her as to her father's experience and ability to help us in these atmospheric rivers and heat domes.
Well, as much as I don't know anything about those, let us, without any further ado, introduce Eddy Carmack.
Hello, Eddy. Welcome to the show.
How are you?
Well, hello, Calen and Sam. Thank you for the invitation.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background? And I guess I should let all our listeners know that Eddy Carmack's actually Maryanne Carmack from Roast, who's also a president of Bread and Butter Collective, is her father, who happens to have some experience in I guess, Eddy, tell us your experience. You can hear from yourself.
Okay. Well, the work that I've been doing is in climate science, specifically the oceans and lakes, and then location-wise in the high latitudes. So that would mean the Arctic. I've worked also in Siberia, Antarctic, and this has all started out, I have to reveal my age, and it started 52 years ago with the first trip to the Arctic. So
you were an infant.
No, this not at all. Well, we all were infants at some time, yeah. No, it was quite an experience traveling into Canada's Arctic, and when being there, I don't know, it was like being in a place that was pristine and could never change. And then you fast forward these 52 years, and we're finding that the Arctic is the leader in climate change, if that's a distinction or not. But things there are changing faster than anywhere else in the world, 2, 3, maybe 4 times as fast. So it's become a kind of a laboratory to look into the future. If you want to know what's coming, you go up there and have a look around, and you can start seeing what this averaged out weather is doing to the planet. And to put that date into perspective, I kind of like to say I could either have gone to the Arctic or gone to Woodstock and become a rock star, but it was the same year, and here we are.
I've seen your documentary, Eddy, and I'd say you kind of picked the halfway point between rock star and environmentalist. Oh,
you've been listening to my daughter, then.
I have actually, but I did watch the documentary where you were going up. I guess it was about 30 years ago where you went to the Arctic, right?
Yeah, that was a joint effort with the United States, and the idea was that Canada and U.S. would put forth their most powerful icebreakers and make the first transit to the North Pole via the western entrance, that is, coming in from the Pacific. And we ended up going all the way across and popping out into the North Atlantic on the other side. Now, that was an interesting cruise, in that we put together a science plan, and we identified at the time what a group of 70 scientists could do in terms of understanding climate, contaminants, and carbon. So if you think about those three words, what we were worried about 30 years ago are the things we still worry about today. And I like to think that science has made remarkable strides in understanding these things over that 30 years. Policy is lagging a little bit behind and still playing catch up. So our hopes of bridging immediately from science to policy were not quite fulfilled. But things are changing along those lines now, and the outlook, I think, is much better.
Do you think, you speak of this, the gap in the policy versus the science? Do you think, I imagine that gap 30 years ago was, very wide, because obviously, it was beginning to be on the minds of people, I'm sure, scientists especially. Is that gap, do you think it's narrowing, or is the rhetoric getting in the way of it? What is your view on where things are now with, we talked about the government implementations of climate policies and all those things. Is that in line with what you feel is making an effort?
Well, I have a positive view on that. I think so many people now know where the Arctic is, for one thing. And it's in the news all the time. I think when we went to the North Pole, we made page D17 in the Times Colonist, so it wasn't a big thing 30 years ago. And along those same lines, a dozen or so years ago, we had a program that used two icebreakers, one leaving from Victoria, the other leaving from St. John's, Newfoundland, and they both had operational assignments to go to the Arctic. So we had science aboard, and so they could encircle all of northern North America. We thought that this would be something like an antenna to see what's coming to Canada from the ocean, and maybe think of it as a climate dew line structure. So we've set that information is set up. It needs follow-up and it needs application. And as we come through to today, well, I've been retired now for a decade, but I don't know that I actually was ever working. It's more like so exciting. Never seemed like work. But today I keep active in a volunteer sense, and these activities are policy related. One is with the World Wildlife Federation out of Norway, and they want to use climate prediction models to state what the Arctic will be like in, say, 30 years, and then devise what we think the biology will be like accordingly, and then use that information to develop their own policies for conservation. Another one, which goes from the complete other side of the coin, is with a group called the Arctic Base Camp, and that's led by Gail Whiteman out of the UK. And the notion with Arctic Base Camp is she's an economist, so she says, the Arctic is really an important part of this story, and we need to get the Arctic into the boardrooms. We got to let Fortune 500 companies know that they've got a responsibility to help with this. So that's coming at it from the economic, the financial aid, and there's where you see people like Mark Carney stepping up and just delivering home runs with his book and the work he did for COP26. And then more to what I enjoy doing, which is going out into the field. Another group is they call the Arctic Research Foundation. and it's a charitable foundation that started up about a decade ago. And their aim is to build a NGO type logistical base. By that, ships and mobile labs and transportation, because it's very hard and very expensive to work in the Arctic. Ships are very expensive. When I left DFO, one ship was costing us $1 a second to be on. So that comes out $86,000 a day. So ships can be very expensive and limiting in our resources. So we're looking more to smaller boats and community-based boats spreading out across the Arctic, so that'll give people a chance to study there. And also working with communities, which is absolutely essential in the Canadian Arctic, because so much of the knowledge resides in local people. So that's a triangle of activity that's trying to move in this policy direction.
And with those policy directions, you've referred to the Canadian Arctic as just that, the Canadian Arctic. But it feels to me like if we're going to tackle environmental issues, we have to start thinking about the Arctic as a global entity, don't we? And do you think if we do start thinking about it globally as the Arctic Circle as a whole, how do you get the different kinds of governments engaged enough and non-competitively enough to act? Or do you feel like there might be a place more for businesses and in economic interests, like a northern trade route that's gonna be able to develop and create the money that will save the Arctic eventually? Or, sorry, that was a loaded question.
You're raising it, you're raising it to the right level. Climate change is a pan-Arctic problem. The ice doesn't just melt in the Canadian Arctic, it melts off the coast of Siberia, and it melts off the Alaska coast, and all of these changes are often site-specific. Like take a particular region and you force it with climate and change, and the response of one region might be vastly different from another region, because the Arctic isn't just one thing, it's a collection. It's many parts to a complicated geography. So I come back to the Canadian Arctic because I think every country must pull its weight. And we do have the longest coastline in the Arctic. We're an Arctic nation. We have, I think, the coldest capital in the world outside of Mongolia. So there's much responsibility to our country. So anything that can be done to advance our capacity to work in the Arctic and bring stories forward, bring people forward, is worth the effort and time.
Is there some, like, obviously there's sovereignty issues with the Arctic. I know Russia has exerted themselves there in, I imagine a quest to obtain their rights and whatnot. Do you see that as being a major barrier to trying to solve some of these issues or be able to work together?
Well, when I started out, we going back again 5 decades, working in the Soviet Union was the challenge. So you come forward, and working in the Arctic, working in Russia is the challenge. It's there are those geopolitical boundaries. Scientists, when given the opportunity, will cross those boundaries, no doubt about it. I mean, some of my favorite, best colleagues are Russian. Some still living in Russia, and some here, some in the United States. So yes, there are geopolitical barriers that people are working on whenever we have a chance, or some other colleagues more so than I, to work across these barriers. Then we make every effort we can to do that. There's also this idea that, getting back to the Canadian Arctic, that we do have an indigenous population up there, and what are their concerns about climate change? I mean, if you look at where many of the indigenous populations are, they're spread throughout the Northwest Passage. They're coastal communities, and if they're interior, they're likely on lakes or along rivers. So their needs are very much tied to what you call the water sphere side of things. That doesn't rule out the importance of the tundra, soil, permafrost, all of these things. But there is a need to incorporate their knowledge into how we develop policies, be respectful and sensitive, and learn together.
Do you see the indigenous populations up there being a good way to, kind of spearhead real change there? I mean, obviously, we've identified a couple different issues. Obviously, the geopolitical thing is relevant, and ownership, quote unquote, of the Arctic and whose responsibility. But obviously, some of those lack of policies or lack of direction or leadership on those fronts might be stalling an ability to either get information out about what's happening in the Arctic, which can then be a precursor to forecasting, lower land levels of impact for the climate change. I think it's an interesting point when you mentioned the indigenous population up there, and I could see that as an opportunity to really, create a bond on the subject and identify things that are happening and that we need to mitigate, but also use to forecast. Do you see that as an important piece to this?
Absolutely, yeah. And getting back, let's bounce back up to that question that Sam asked about the centering on the Pan-Arctic or the global scale. And it's really important, and maybe if you're a photographer, you know what zooming is. You need to have your mind able to zoom out and see the big scale, but come back in and say, okay, now I'm going to look at Canada and what our policies and responsibilities are. Now I'm going to zoom down a little further, and now I'm going to come right back down to Lutzel Cay on the shore of Great Slave Lake. And then how can we work together to better understand climate? And this has also been a kind of a I don't like the word passion, but it really is something I'm stuck on, and that is coming down to, if you want to understand the region, people who live there are your best resource. And we've worked with the Canadian Rangers in the Arctic to supply science kits, so that when they go out on the ice with their skidoos and komatuks, they take instruments with them, and they're making valuable measurements. And if we had to fly a team up there and and all that stuff, it costs an arm and a leg. But in this way, we're not only we're gaining knowledge, we're working together, we're hopefully growing trust, which has been damaged and needs to be worked on. And it's cost effective, and you can cover so much more of the Arctic by hopscotching with a network of communities. Now, the Pacific Salmon Foundation here, in Salish Sea, started a citizen science program on this idea too, and I call it fishboat science. They call it their citizen science program. But the idea again is you have people own boats, small boats, big boats, whatever boats. With a science kit, they can go out and spread out, and they can take a snapshot of the state of the Salish Sea at any one given day, and moment all together. Whereas a single ship would be going from one place to the next, and you kind of get a blurred image of the situation.
One, I think you also probably have there's some inherent bias in the ability to, I mean, the local knowledge would seem to be paramount in this, where you could be sitting in your office in New York or Toronto or Ottawa or Victoria or Sydney and make assumptions that, if you talk to people on the ground, they would say, oh no, that doesn't go that way, it goes this way because of this reason or that reason. I think that's common sense, but I think we probably lack some of that in this execution.
Can I just jump in, because I think I'd be remiss if I didn't include this right now, is that it makes me really think of an archaeologist I heard talking about Central America, and they were hunting for ancient cities and ancient civilizations, and they weren't finding very much until they went and asked the local people, and all of a sudden they're like, yeah, there's a temple over there, there's a temple over there, and there's this over here. And sure enough, they just knew where everything was. And that got me into a conversation this morning. And I heard that maybe you, Eddie, did something like this and were part of finding the Franklin expedition.
Well, yes. I'll defer credit, but the Arctic Research Foundation, when it first came together, its mission was to help find Franklin's lost ships, and they did it with an old fish boat, but they were there, and they logged about 80% of the side sand sonar track. To find those ships, you go along with towing a side scan sonar, and you look for some bump on the bottom. And if you want to really do something boring, sit and watch. It's like mowing the lawn. You go for 10 kilometers, to move over 50 meters, turn around, and go back another 10 kilometers. But anyway, that was collaborative with Parks Canada. But I give credit to the Arctic Research Foundation. They went into Johaven. They listened to an Inuit. He told his story, what he saw, and they thought, well, we'll take a detour and go check this out. And lo and behold, they found the Terror. Absolutely, you're going to find knowledge that you never thought existed, and listening to stories. I've had wonderful experiences listening to an elder or an experienced person tell it as a story and say, well, it's a scientist, what does that mean to me? How can I interpret that story if I'm talking about if you catch fish on this side of the point, you have to put oil in the pan. If you catch fish on this side of the point, you don't have to put oil in the pan. Things like that, and just enlighten all of a sudden, what's going on in the ocean now that's causing the same species of fish to be fat and skinny, depending on where it is in this small regional area. So the other thing, I think we started to touch on this and about understanding and how do we how do we make the sacrifices that need to be made in order to slow down this catastrophe? Well, it's not a catastrophe yet, but how do we deal with it? And to make sacrifices, you're gonna have to protect it. And to protect something, you have to go back a step. You have to appreciate it. And to appreciate something, you have to have some knowledge of it. I could pull, let's say, opera out. I'm not going to ever. I'm probably not going to try to protect opera because I don't appreciate it because I don't have knowledge of it. But the environment is much the same way. In these past 20 and 30 and 50 years, science has learned so much about the other side of the nature story. And we hear all the bad stories. They make the news. The loss of the sea ice, on and on and on. But the good side of that story is that we're learning so much about nature that we cannot fail to appreciate it. Just how butterflies migrate along continents, and what bad policies can do to disrupt that, and then we can make changes. So I'm let's say an advocate of learning about nature so that you'll have the understanding to appreciate it and then the will to protect it.
Right. So you can't really manage what you don't measure, right? And it sounds like there's been a lot of
we're reading each other's mail there.
Nice.
Yeah, you can't monitor what you don't know what you're monitoring. But we often set out to do just that.
I've got a question that might make you think a bit, I hope. In our current pandemic that we're in right now, and how the globe has kind of come together and has done lots. We've organized, we've mandated policies, we've controlled people, we've controlled environments. Is this kind of action like a precursor or an education for people as to what we might expect if we want to get past the climate crises that we face? Is this the sort of thing that will prepare us for how we need to get past this?
Well, I think you have a really good point, Sam. I mean, various lines of science are coming back to show how air quality improved, how the soundscape improved, how many things improved during the early stages of the pandemic and the shutdown. So it was kind of like a trial run, and it should give hope that we can do something about it. It's just the motivation isn't quite as pressing because we have this idea that we're talking about what's going to happen in 30 years or 50 years, whereas the pandemic was right now, and so people act fast.
It kind of feels like we've been talking about this for 30 to 50 years now, and it's about to happen real fast.
Yeah, we're losing we're losing our grasp on that time scale. This is kind of enigmatic or controversial thing, but climate is the average of weather. Climate is why you decide to live in a certain place or something, because you know what the average is. This is how you do your agriculture. This is how you plan all kinds of things. But weather climate's the average of weather. At any given moment, there's no climate. It's all a bunch of weather running around out there. And what we're seeing is a lot of weather escaping from. If you think that climate is a corral with a lot of weather kept inside of it like cattle, weather is escaping now, and it's coming at us with these extremely wet veins, the atmospheric rivers. It's coming at us with heat domes and things like that. So what's coming in the future may be much worse, but it has arrived. It's melting the ice caps. It's raising sea level. It's anomalous weather. These events are all happening. So yes, the pandemic is a really good metaphor or example of what we need to do.
That's pretty scary from my perspective. You see, I think the truth is always in the middle, but it feels now with these, convoys and, protests and things like that. I do agree that the globe did a fairly okay job working together and trying to save lives. Obviously, different groups had better success than others, depending on what they were prepared to give up. Obviously, the climate change, obviously it's happening. We know it's happening. Science says it's happening. As you mentioned, it's future forward as far as stuff. And I think in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen examples of this weather breaking through the corral. And I think that's a great analogy. There's also the component of mitigation. Focus on the bigger goal of trying to figure out how we get ourselves off fossil fuels in a way that isn't going to create more crises as well is important. But as there's a dike that breached in Abbotsford that perhaps could have been, we could have mitigated some of the impact of that, of just maintaining and looking for ways, knowing it's going to happen, but yet you've got critical infrastructure that's not upgraded, updated, and the effects of it are 10 times worse than had we, so at what point, if we're not able to address the bigger climate issues of China with coal, oil and gas and things like that, like how do we switch the sense of responsibility to mitigation?
Well, that's a multi-trillion-dollar question. And yeah, you brought up a good point. I mean, a significant portion of the population, the outstanding portion of the population, puts the good of the whole before a selfish action, I think. And we have to count on that. There will be times to convince actions otherwise. We'll have to see how this all plays out. It's a good preview. But I think we will recognize what happened. You mentioned mitigation, and often climate change is talked about, climate action is talked about in terms of adaptation or mitigation. Adaptation is like the Boy Scouts say, be prepared, adapt what you're doing and make sure that you're one step ahead of what's coming down the pipe. Mitigation is building electric cars or going electric. All of these things, so they're all important. Now, and a lot of money is being invested in climate action. It seems, I've heard that that a lot more is going to mitigation than is going to adaptation or preparation. So maybe we're not spending money on those dikes that we needed, but we would spend money on cars that could make a profit. So really, it's tricky. But the main thing is everyone, what they're doing and what they've got, and judging its impact on the future.
If we could create a carbon filter capture system that was portable and everyone could have in their backyard, and you painted up really cool and made sure everyone really wanted them, and then sold them for a huge amount of money, like an iPhone or something, that might solve the problem. You got to make people want them.
Yes. Well, a lot of these, engineering solutions, there's many ideas out there. They do need to be tested. Carbon capture there's so much carbon dioxide. It's hard for me to imagine how you can capture it. But so everything we do, every step we take, is going to have to be looked at, and again, zooming back to the larger picture and how different things come together at that size. I think, like Calen, you can boast, and I think rightly so, that you have a carbon neutral business. That's terrific.
Don't call me out, Eddy. Don't call me out.
No, I won't. And you could ask, well, is this good or is this bad, or is it? And I think the general answer to what things like that is absolutely, it's good. But and I'm not talking about big wheel, anything. I'm saying in general, though, when you see carbon neutral, then you need to do zoom out a little bit and say, well, what else? What are the consequences of this particular product or action or activity doing? Is it using a lot of water, which we also need? And that's all I mean is you can't look at just say carbon neutral. That's it. That's all. It's good for everybody. It doesn't fit everything.
No, I think, let me jump in because I agree with that point completely. And I think it sort of demonstrates sort of my frustrations with even the electric car. I've looked at a fair amount of information on emissions from construct or like design and build to use. And, it's somewhere between year 3 or year 5 that you start decreasing the emissions overall between combustion engines and electric vehicles. But significantly after that point goes down, although you look at the information and the average person keeps their car for 4 to 5 years. So then they're starting to cycle over again before they've maximized the benefit of the thing. And then you also, of the electric vehicle, but then you also look at the inputs as far as the minerals required to do it and how those things are mined. And I mean, it's endless, which I guess is kind of paralysis by analysis to some degree.
Well, you're pulling me a long way out of my comfort zone. Let's say, a little article.
Mine too.
Talking about
I
the
put
future
burgers.
Cars. And let it not be said that I'm not in favor of electric cars. Absolutely. I think engineering will address these problems as needed, and things will get more efficient. So we absolutely must move off of carbon-based supplies, energy supply. Yeah. Now, another thing, though, since we're getting into all this, let's see, we lost Calen?
Nope. I'm still here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're getting into the circular economy, the reuse of things. As electric cars wear out, you recycle all the components, there was a kind of a landmark paper that came out 12 years ago out of the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden. And they define these things they call planetary boundaries. And it's a really interesting concept. I mean, you could Google it and you'll get all you ever wanted to know about it. But the authors, and there were many authors, defined 9 things that need to be examined in terms of how much Earth can take. And this, we're talking about planetary boundary for acidification of the oceans, of climate change, these types of things. And it's a really good rule of thumb. You start adding up all of this stuff to see how far you're pushing the Earth's ability to assimilate all of this stuff. And just this month, another paper came out. I think it's going to prove to be interesting. And they've added basically trash to a planetary boundary, and the amount of plastic in the world now outweighs the total weight of humans. We've exceeded the. I mean, and it's part of, we're thinking it's making its way to the Arctic. It's showing up in beluga. It's everywhere in these microplastics and everything. So
I was just going to ask you about that.
And I know, and here's I'll mention bread and butter now that you have a program where you're recycling food containers. Well, that's huge. The amount of, stuff that goes into our dumps and into our water systems and everything needs those kind of actions and activities. And next time I'm down to the market, I'm certainly going to buy myself a reusable, recyclable food container. And
Nice.
Well, I guess part of, sorry to interrupt, but part of it for me is trying to turn some of these things into actions. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. I think one is to bring down the temperature on the fear of things, because I think that in itself can paralyze people into either not doing the right action or spending too much energy and resources in a way that doesn't really move us forward. Whereas I find that if us doing, like, even Big Wheel Burger and Zambri's being carbon neutral, it's something. I mean, we're composting everything. We've now vetted where our compost goes. So it's just about checking these boxes that what you're doing has integrity, and serves some action and doesn't create another problem over there. And just like the bread and butter collective recycled container thing, again, it's good steps. And I've done some interviews on that, as Sam has, and people talk about, well, they're plastic and you're creating it. Okay, well, yeah, they are plastic. They're denser. There's 1,000 use life out of them, or washes. So, it's, for every action, there's obviously an environmental impact of it, even though in the short term, it's probably a good thing. But I think the paralysis by just thinking the problem's too big is sometimes it just really needs to go down to simple things like talking to indigenous populations on the coast in the Arctic on how best we can deal with things and what they're seeing and witnessing, and I think it's just bringing it back to the individual again a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, of course I know through Maryanne some of the things that Bread and Butter is doing, and Kyle, she mentioned your work with the coffee industry and traveling to Latin America and visiting the plantations or the sites, and all things like that are critically important too, because we start just getting the knowledge that you need to make food supply more sustainable and less intrusive on the environment. And she also told me you're doing something like finding byproducts from coffee so that workers can stay on the job longer, and
I'm having one right now. This tea is made by coffee leaves, and
really?
yeah,
Okay.
and so this tea is being picked so that the employees of the farm can stay in one spot for 12 months a year, as opposed to having to migrate and see where the coffee cherries are to be picked.
Yeah, I mean, there's 7 billion people who can create and contribute 7 billion ideas how to make this a better planet, a more sustainable planet, and get us forward. There is going to be transformation, and it's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. But the collective effort of many, many people offers hope. Yeah,
I mean, I definitely I view things as optimistic. I'm an optimist by nature. I also know throughout history, humans have been very adaptable, but also innovative. And I think that is an area that, investing, rather than circling the problem, kind of investing and putting some energy and money into new innovations and examining further some of those, carbon capture technologies and safe nuclear to some degree. The reality of it is, and I think this is lost a little bit in the discussions, is population as a whole is significantly more prosperous due to energy and the oil and gas. Like, as much as that may get me shot or funny looks in Vancouver Island, but I mean, it's elevated, mass populations out of extreme poverty. And if you look at, for the last 500 years of human existence, and how every year and compounded by centuries, we've improved the lives of, billions of people, I think that gets lost a little bit. But I do know that we're adaptable. So I have pretty much confidence in the fact that we will solve it in a way that won't completely, before it destroys us, so to speak.
Yeah, the Earth only has so much currency to put toward the goals, and we're really using it up. Not much capital.
Well, I think we need to eliminate the things that we're doing or doing it in a way that has less impact. So, I think these discussions are all positive towards that. And I guess the frustration is just, the 4-year cycles of politics and, listening to the rhetoric and not kind of seeing real action. I know the current situation. What are your thoughts around that, even in the Arctic? Like, imagine some of the stuff that's happened up there, and just even to do with the geopolitical landscape of Russia and ownership and the people up there. Are you concerned or?
Concerned, and I'm not sure I understand concerned in what way.
Well, I guess in that, you spent a significant amount of your career in the Arctic. Are you frustrated with the state of the Arctic now, or are you hopeful? What is your overall outlook?
I'm not frustrated. I am hopeful, and I spent a lot of time on big ships, burning lots of fuel in my career to understand the Arctic, and that's a fact of life. An icebreaker can burn, well, I won't say how much. It can burn an enormous amount of fuel in a day, making its way through ice. And all in the hope of better understanding it. Now we've got a lot of knowledge, and we can start asking questions and setting up policies that can address the issues that we're seeing. We can address the rate at which rivers and streams and the surface water of the ocean is warming, to address whether or not that water is going to become too warm for the fish that are there. So I think I'm optimistic again that things are going in the right direction, and the Indigenous leadership in Canada has grown. They are now a big part of what gets done up there, what gets looked at, and what actions are taken. They're taking control, and that's undoubtedly going to lead us to a more positive, less exploitive life. That said,
that's very good news.
Yeah,
food sustainability remains a huge challenge in the north, with the cost of shipping there, and the fact that a lot of it has to come in with on a container ship once a year and then be stored, and diets aren't good, and the local food, country foods are more and more difficult to find and are being challenged. So a lot of innovative work needs to be done to have cooperations that help address that problem.
In Victoria and in the Bread and Butter Collective, we all kind of agree that we want to reduce the amount of plastic we put out. Anything we can use that is compostable, we should be using, and we all make a very good effort on that in our collective. But it kind of begs the question, if a compostable straw, or the efforts made to only have compostable straws, not plastic ones, is just the tip of the melting iceberg, or if it's important enough because it's so small, it's just like a small bit of everything else that we need to be thinking about. And those who are thinking about the compostable straws are also the ones thinking about how much they fly and where they're sourcing their ingredients from. Does that make sense to you? Is it just the tip of that melting iceberg? Does it matter?
Well, That's again a place I don't really want to go because everything matters. It's just that and does it get attention? Does it cause people to think more broadly? I don't know the fraction of this massive amount of biomass that's accumulated on the earth, and that comes from plastic straws. But do you even need a straw? Can you just sip it?
I think you touched on Eddie. I think you touched on a point there, where you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I do think it is a bridge, and maybe to Sam's point, the tip of the melting iceberg, which is probably a good way to think about it. But I do think it then spurs people to look at some of their consumption and whether they're composting. I know our information and how many people are reaching out to us to verify whether or not our goods are actually composted and not just sent to the landfill. I think those are great questions, and I think people need to be investigating and thinking for themselves like that. So I do think it probably exposes people to the idea around it. And as much as when it first came out, where I was looking at plastic straws, I'm like, oh my God, plastic straws? Is this what we're dealing with? But I do, and it's like paper or plastic bags in the city too, where there's huge uproar and about that. But I do think this is part of the process and the journey we're on. And hopefully it'll cause more people to start investigating even things about the Arctic and the origin story of where the science sort of realized things were going sideways. And I would imagine it started in the poles, right? That would have been the reason why you were up there.
I was up there because I thought I had found a place of adventure and pristine beauty, and it would never be altered. All of those callings. And then something happened.
That's very romantic.
Yeah. No, but Well, when we're talking about some things like this, about recyclable items, I think back being in the Soviet Union back in the late 80s, and everybody ran around with a plastic bag, and they were really nicely decorated. But we would throw those away in a heartbeat, use it once, throw it away. But that was, they call them perhaps bags, because perhaps you might just find something in the store that you want to buy, and you can toss it in your perhaps. Well, I doubt it's like that in Russia now, but and another way of thinking of it, they're 30, 40 years ahead of their time, and now we do have that. We have caught on. You can carry a nice bag when you go shopping, and you don't have to use that. I don't know how far to take this and how important it is, but just every step in the right direction counts and brings awareness. And I wish I could think of something offhand right now that seemed like trivia 30 years ago, and now we recognize that it's a massive problem.
Well, how about plastics in the oceans?
I went to a conference, and this guy stood up and says, "We got to worry about ocean acidification." And I thought, what's that ever going to happen? And now we know that it's one of the major threats facing life in the sea. So don't ever underestimate what you hear. I think
that kind of stuff leads to action too. Just maybe slower than it needs to.
To face climate change, I don't want to go really into areas I don't understand, but we do need to make, just like we need to make vaccines available to the rest of the world, the third world, or whatever you want to call it. We do need to flatten the economy a little bit. Right now the economy is just a steep pyramid. There's a huge amount of money at the top. It's just way too high. To pull that down and see that that wealth is more evenly available and distributed to fight poverty and the things that we want to eliminate. Then when you're not starving or fighting to feed your family, you've got time to think about, well, what sacrifices can I make to make the world a better place, to cut down, to slow the advance of greenhouse warming and all that. But we need a strong...
When you're in survival mode, you aren't thinking about the options for everybody else. You're thinking about the only option for yourself, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah. The three of us can sit here and talk about it, but we're beneficiaries of a pretty strong economy. And if you're, struggling, if you're sorting through garbage in the city dump to find food for your family, climate change is the last thing on your mind. So,
yeah, and I think
so many
the inequality
that are all tied together that we need to address to move forward.
Well, the economic inequality, I think, is definitely as good a place to start as anywhere. And just like the vaccines, we need to get them to the populations that don't have access. And I think that's just the sum up of all of it. So, Eddy, I think this conversation has been fantastic. Do you want to leave us with any pearls of wisdom on top of the ones you've already put down?
Oh, I can. Maryanne could vouch for this. I mean, we have a little saying in our family when we say goodbye. We often say, "Go do good things," instead of just goodbye.
Oh,
do good things.
I love that.
That's beautiful. I like that too. I take out of this conversation that in order to solve the ecological problems, we need to work on the humanitarian problems that we're facing, so we can all be working together, not some working more than others are capable of working.
It's this whole, how do we deal with all of these various problems? How do we deal with climate change? And I like to think of, you're sitting on your deck maybe, and how do we measure it? How do we monitor it? There's so many things. Like I say, you're sitting on your deck and you see a snowflake come down. You say, oh, there's a snowflake. And then you can say, oh, there's another, oh, another. And all of a sudden you're in a blizzard. Now try to count the snowflakes. No government has, I don't think any government has the ability to monitor itself and all the things that are going on within that government. And it's going to take a concerted effort to try to refocus so that we understand all of these different elements of change that are happening right now. Measure them and come up with strategies to cope with them. Because we are in a blizzard right now, I think.
Yeah, I think the blizzard started. I think that's a given for sure.
Yeah, and information.
I remember a statistic that's something like, I may miss the number, but it's 350,000 different chemicals are produced by industry right now. Wow. So who's going to count 350? It's immense challenges out there. But there's hope. I'm going to stop.
Listen, are you ending this on its...
Please make it positive at the end.
Eddy,
I remember one of you guys promised me a beer at some point. So we'll leave it at that.
Oh, Eddy, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for your time. And when we're able to get together safely, let's get together for a coffee. Love to, or even lunch. Love to buy you lunch.
With no plastic straws. Yes,
no
plastic straws.
Container, an eco container for sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's been great talking
to you.
Thanks,
Eddy. Appreciate it. Thank you.
I really enjoyed your insights. Thanks so much, Eddy, for your time and your efforts.
All right. Welcome.
Wow, Eddy was fantastic. Wasn't that good?
That was a really great conversation, man. I could have talked to him for hours. I wanted to ask him all about like the Franklin expedition and all his time up north and Yeah,
I think
he's got
I think he'd make a
stories.
great guest host. You know, like just the wisdom from Eddy. Even though he's very cautious in talking about things that he's not an expert in, which I appreciate. Um,
I
he,
really appreciated that too. It's
yeah,
like
it was
most
sage
people to just
advice.
jump.
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in anything, so but I talk like I am, which I do it. So it's interesting to see someone who doesn't, which maybe I can learn something from.
Calen, this is our podcast, and we know everything. I
Well, it's
think that's
true.
just
It
as soon
is
as the
true.
podcast stops recording, we're dumb as a bag of hammers. I'm sure. Well, I speak
I
for
would
myself.
agree. But I do think that obviously, we tend to try to deal with, business things, restaurant specific hospitality issues, and much like our local government, who strays off into the area of the bigger issues that isn't under their mandate. It's not necessarily under our mandate, but I do think us as individuals can definitely play a role, and even sharing information and understanding what is happening in the Arctic, but also the difference distinction between climate and weather, and the
Yeah.
different impacts there. And yeah, I think all discussions are good, and of course, any good discussion is going to produce more questions than answers, which I think is what makes life interesting, is investigating, the answers to the questions rather than, just thinking all the answers, because which is probably a sum up of a problem that we have in general with what's going on in the political world, and all that stuff now is less talking, more listening.
Yeah, right. There's been a few podcasts that we've done over the last couple of years now that have really inspired me to act.
Mm-hmm.
One was the BDC, one was the living wage, and now this one. Oh, and the mental health really inspired me to act, and this one has inspired me to go carbon neutral for next year. Even though we didn't get much into it, it was inspiring nonetheless, and I've decided now that this is what I'm taking out of this
Well, and
podcast.
I think for me, the idea that we've been able to share knowledge and have these discussions that have, even if it's just you that have been mobilized to take action. And I do know that I've had feedback from other listeners, and they've really resonated with some of the stuff that we've talked about, which I think obviously makes me feel good. But I do think that what we're doing is producing results, and even if it's amongst our own group, then everything starts somewhere, and I think that's no better place to start than with ourselves.
That's right. All good change starts at home.
And speaking of change, we are about to wrap up season 3. Our next episode will be the end of season 2 of our podcast. I don't know how many we've got now, but I think we're over 20 or something. So I guess we'll defer to Kyle on the actual stats of it. But next week will be our wrap up of season 2. We'll do a sort of overview on what we discussed, talk about some highlights, any lowlights, and then what we can look forward to with our next season of the Bread and Butter podcast.
Wow, 2 seasons with you has been pretty awesome.
It feels
Both
like
of
it's
you,
been a
Calen and Kyle.
lifetime, Sam. A beautiful, magical lifetime on a beach.
Beautiful, magical lifetime.
It's imagery. It's all about the imagery.
Well,
Okay.
I'm really looking forward to our last one and our next one.
Yes, I love it. And thanks to Kyle, our producer, who's an amazing, fantastic talent, who's so enjoyable and keeps us looking professional.
I think he's our super producer. Isn't that what they call him? The super producer. You got to have a little sound effect every time we say Kyle or super producer. You got to have a little air horn or something.
There we go.
So for the next episode, Kyle, we're gonna introduce a Kyle sound effect. So
All right, sounds
start
good.
working on it.
I'll bring it in.
I'm going to start working on it right now, so I have all week to figure
There you
something
go.
fun out.
All right, let's do it.
That is awesome. I love it. All right. Well, thank you to everybody, and remember to be kind
Yeah. Be nice, be kind.
and do good things.
Bread and Butter Collective's membership includes the following local businesses: 2% Jazz, 900 Degrees Wood-Fired Pizzeria, Agrius, Big Wheel Burger, Blue Mountain Solutions, Bodega Tapas Wine Bar, Brentwood Bay Village Emporium, Nourish and Charlotte the Quail, Victoria Chocolate and Company, Drum Roaster Coffee, Habit Coffee, Foo Asian Street Food, the Culinary Arts Program at Camosun, Cafe Fantastico, Fall Epi, Harold Street Brewworks, Hey Happy, House of Botang, Hoyne Brewing, Jenny Marie's Cracker Company, La Pasta, La Rue Patisserie, Mocha House, Part and Parcel, Poco a Pinto Bar, Pizzeria Prima Strada, Rain Dogs, Roast, Table 9 Consulting, Sherwood Cafe and Bar, Sweets by Selena, The Collective Wine Bar and Kitchen, The Drake, Tapa Bar, Taco Stand Al Pastor, Toque, The Whole Beast, The Wienery, and Zambries.
To hear more from the Bread and Butter Collective, go to checknews.ca/podcasts on Check Plus, or find us on your favorite podcasting platform.